Yeah, so my presentation today is titled The Revival of Subjectivity. And this, I guess, is in response to the general theme of the conference. So we're asking about new directions in continental philosophy, and this is, I guess, part of my conjecture because I studied for a PhD at McGill University in Canada. So last year when I joined the conference here, I actually was presenting part of my dissertation. But now, as long as I have graduated and finished my dissertation, I think I'm at a place to make some conjectures, make some projections about what those new directions are for me as well, but also for us, for the continental philosophers that we are. And one issue that came up to me is this issue of subjectivity, because when we just look at the contemporary research in the area of continental philosophy, there has been a lot of debate about whether we should still speak of the subject at all, or what do we mean when we talk about subjectivity. And my approach today is to analyze the issue under the framework of a certain overcoming of what I call the ontological monism that I found in some versions of contemporary continental philosophy. So that was the basic idea. So I would like to introduce the issue by saying that the subject is actually under serious attack in contemporary continental philosophy. Ever since, I guess, Heidegger turned from his analytic of Dasein to a more like being-centered ontology or metaphysics, and even to react against ontology and metaphysics. So that was the moment when continental philosophy as a whole turned drastically against the idea of subjectivity. So that was contrary to Husserl's original project of clarifying, for example, the structures of the transcendental ego. Right? So under that banner, a lot of philosophers tried to explain subjectivity in relation to something that's underneath, or something that's beyond, or something that's more ancient than subjectivity itself. So I enumerate some of the ideas here. I don't have time to get into them, but perhaps some of you guys will be able to notice something about Derrida, something about Levinas, something about Lacan here. So I'm just listing these themes which have been explored in more recent versions of continental philosophy. And what's applicable to all these versions is that there is supposed to be a layer which is beneath or beyond or enveloping or more ancient than the subject. Moreover, this layer, so this we could call it pre-subjective layer, or the pre-personal layer. So this layer is supposed to be incapable of being reflected upon per se. So we can of course come to reflection of it, but as long as we're doing so, we're transforming it. We're transforming it into something that lends itself to conscious reflection. Whereas the principle itself, which we reflect upon, would resist being presented per se. So that's, I guess, was a push against the transcendental mode of inquiry that we observe in Husserl, because here we're saying that the transcendental condition of our experience, usually discussed under the title of subjectivity, is now, I'd say, it's not only transcendental, it's transcendent. So it's beyond our capture. And we can only see ourselves as waves at the surface of a deep sea. And we can only fathom into the sea, but we can never get a full grasp of it. So that's the basic image that I see in this trend of what we could loosely call anti-subjectivism in more recent versions of continental philosophy. Now, I don't intend to kind of problematize this tendency or to ask whether we can theorize about what in principle resists reflection, because that's itself an internal difficulty to this orientation of study. What I want to problematize here is, I guess, an implication of it. So you could see it as a certain kind of external critique, but not from another philosophical tradition. It's from our experience and from our concern with what we want to make sense of with our philosophical theories nowadays. So it's a concern, I guess, which is practical. Let's put it that way. So there is a certain ontological monism which I see in this attempt to dissolve the subject, to dissolve subjectivity. And the idea is that there is a singular principle which dictates all the rules which are followed by the totality of beings, and human beings are included here. And that's when we talk about something that's underneath subjectivity, something that's beyond it, something that's enveloping it. And so in this scenario, subjectivity can be subsumed under this singular principle, and eventually it could be explained away. So it's not just explained, it's explained away in the sense that subjectivity is not fundamental here. It's something like an epiphenomenon. It's something like a derivative phenomenon, like that. And this usually tends towards a naturalistic account, though this does not always converge with contemporary natural sciences. So one could have a naturalistic account of subjectivity without appealing to, for example, neuroscience. One could instead put up a more anonymous kind of nature. So this nature envelopes all the subjects and gives rise to all the concerns of the subjects, but the nature itself does not lend itself to the grasp of natural sciences, because the natural sciences themselves are also the attempts which the subjects make in order to grasp this otherwise anonymous nature. So that's the basic idea. And I am not sure whether or to what extent we can call this tendency a Spinozism, because I know that there have been conflicting interpretations of Spinoza, but I guess at least we could say that Spinoza was regularly adopted in, for example, contemporary French philosophy, for example, in Deleuze. And to that extent, we might be able to evaluate the whole issue with Spinoza's metaphysical framework. And we know that Spinoza's metaphysical framework was a monism, and an ontological monism. And basically every phenomena we observe in this world are modes or accidentals of this singular substance, God. So this might be a helpful way to approach this whole problematic. And also this tendency was already observable in Heidegger. So I mentioned a bit in the previous slide, but here we could see in more detail that in Heidegger there is the idea, especially since the 1930s, 40s, that this anonymous being will claim each of us, and he characterizes each of us as Daseins. Right? So Sein claims each of Daseins as the site of being. That's the basic idea. And Heidegger could put up claims like, it's not us who speak language, but it's language which speaks us. Right? So here we are seeing all these tendencies already at work in Heidegger, but in more recent versions of it, this tendency was radicalized. in continental philosophy, especially in French continental philosophy, following Heidegger's clue. And here, the case is that the anonymous, so in Heidegger it was being, sein, the anonymous here no longer had to be even meaningful. For Heidegger, it was the case that being must be meaningful. So Heidegger talked about the meaning of being, right? But in more recent versions of continental philosophy, people tend to think that meaning as well belong to the sphere of subjectivity, which is not fundamental here. So the anonymous, whatever we call it, it doesn't have to be meaningful. It could be just nonsense or illogical or something that's incomprehensible. And here, if we place the whole principle of the totality of beings in this anonymous one, then we have this radical version of ontological monism, which I have been talking about. So that's the model we have in mind here. And I now want to talk about an unwanted implication of it. This contemporary version of anti-subjectivism, I think it had its reasons, and it was justified to an extent, to the extent that people developed this idea in order to push against threats from two sides. One side was the kind of subjective voluntarism, and that was associated with Heidegger's Nazi issue. So when continental philosophers wanted to distance themselves from this version of voluntarism, saying, for example, the authentic individual's decisions or resolution could, change the whole scenario of things. If they want to avoid this direction, they will tend towards this non- or anti-subjectivism. On the other hand, they wanted to push against the linguistic idealism, which was prevalent in early analytic philosophy. So if people identify what is with what can be said, what can be expressed in language, what can be analyzed, then we have linguistic idealism. But according to most of the continental philosophers, this linguistic idealism was flawed because it reduced the whole pack of existence to what the subject could grasp with its, for example, linguistic apparatuses. So those two directions were not the same, but they were both set against this contemporary version of anti-subjectivism. So in its birth and in its development, it was already trying to push against both sides. However, in developing this ontological monism, which I talked about on the previous slide, this anti-subjectivism tended more and more towards an impersonalism. So the prioritization of the impersonal, the subpersonal, the suprapersonal. And a result of this is that freedom and agency, which we have been talking about in philosophy, would become either illusory or epiphenomenal. So we could continue to feel that we are free, that we are responsible for what we choose. However, this is just from the perspective of the subject. And remember that in this anti-subjectivism, the subject is not fundamental. So we could say that we feel freedom, we feel that we're free, but it is illusory. It's just according to a non-fundamental perspective. So that's one consequence. And as opposed to this, I guess I don't want to suggest something like an ontological dualism, right? So when we analyze monism, we usually think of its opposite as dualism. For example, the dualism between the subject and the object, between mind and the world, things like that. However, what I want to suggest instead of this ontological monism is, I would call, a pluralism. And it's a pluralism of subjectivities. I want to suggest this version because in the scenario of ontological monism, if we could speak of the landscape of the world, the life world, or the world of meaning, or the world of things, we could see it as having become extremely flat. So there is one unitary underlying principle to this world, and everything grows from it, is grounded in it, and so on. And so this is a very flat structure, and we are not even able to observe like standing constant centers or like centers of radiance, for example, in this scenario of the world. And instead, I wanted to re-problematize or rethink the notion of subjectivity so that we can think of or to preserve the sites of happening. We saw the word site when we were talking about Heidegger here, right? So Heidegger thought that Daseins are sites of being. But can we take this notion of the site more seriously? And to take it seriously, I think, means to respect the locality of manifestation. Manifestation, call it the manifestation of being, call it the manifestation of the unconscious, if you're into psychoanalysis. But in all cases, this manifestation exhibits this locality, which I see in the word of sight, a site of manifestation. And if we respect the locality of manifestation, then of course in the world there will be a plurality, a multitude of sites, of manifestation, and that brings us to a respect to our mutual differences. And that's what I mean by a pluralism of subjectivities. In order to carry out this work in greater detail, I think we can just start from Heidegger, and this is part of the work that I have done already. So I observed that there are actually two layers of subjectivity in Heidegger, if we're entitled to identify Heideggerian Dasein with subjectivity, which is disputable, I know. But we can distinguish between two aspects, two layers of the Heideggerian Dasein. The first layer is reflexivity. Reflexivity is expressed in Heidegger with the word Gemeinigkeit. So every structure or every existential phenomenon for Dasein is in each case mine, as translated in the English version. So that's Gemeinigkeit. On the other hand, in chapter 5 of Division 1 of Being and Time, this notion of disclosedness arose, and its German is Erschlossenheit. These two, I think, describe different aspects of Dasein, and just if we just look at the sequence in which they appear, we might think that reflexivity is more basic than disclosedness, and the idea would be reflexivity is this self-pointing direction or the self-relation expressed classically in Descartes, I think, whereas disclosedness was the name for the fact that each Dasein is a site of happening, but this site is finite. So it must claim a certain place in the world. It cannot be everywhere. It's mortal and so on. So if we just follow the reasoning of Being and Time, we might tend to think that, well, we are first this self-relation. We're first the kind of entity which is capable of questioning our own being, right? That was Heidegger's own expression. And just because of this, are we able to have all the things clarify themselves to us? And this, I would say, is a typically Cartesian model, because the self-relation here precedes and makes possible every relation to the other. We are first a self-relation. We're first this reflexive self, and then we're able to have things disclosed to us. I want to argue, by contrast, that the reverse is the case for Heidegger and for a couple of other Continental philosophers. So if we just limit our discussion to Heidegger, my claim here is that this closeness, as we explain here, actually precedes and makes possible reflexivity. And the reason is that if we take Dasein's temporal structures into consideration, there must be a separation between the current moment of manifestation and the past and future moments of manifestation. So you see, in the temporal structure of Dasein, there is already a focal structure. But in order to have a focus like this, the subject, which here means that to whom beings manifest themselves, so that's the a formal definition of the subject. The subject here must also be local, meaning that it cannot be omnipresent. If the subject were omnipresent, there wouldn't be a difference between the now and the past and the future. So once we need this focal structure, we can understand why each Dasein is a Da. It's a here or there. And it's a Da which is necessitated by the manifestation of Sein, of being. It's not just that we start off as subjects and then we find things in the world. Rather, we can see things from the perspective of being as such and see ourselves as the kind of sites, the kind of finite sites that this being necessarily needs. So that's the alternative model here. And to continue the discussion a little bit, and this is my last slide, and I'm less sure about things I write on this slide because now I'm getting into the domain of German idealism, and I want to continue this discussion in the sphere of German idealism, seeing if I can get some resources to further clarify plurality and finitude, as I discovered in the Heideggerian context. So how do we think of a respect for human finitude and plurality? Well, I think a key idea that we can take a look at is the idea of reconciliation in Hegel. Of course, the classical interpretation of Hegel tends to say, well, first there is this abstract one singular principle, and then it needs concrete determination, and it enters into historical existence. It brings about violence, conflict, and there is finally this process of reconciliation, which seems to bring the multiplicity of the determinate stages back to the oneness of the one. However, I don't think this reconciliation means a vanishing of plurality in the oneness of the one. And that would help us understand why Hegel would oppose, for example, Schelling's account of human freedom in Schelling's Freedom essay, for example. Schelling, too, wanted to account for the plurality of human existence under the title of human freedom. However, Schelling explained it as an implication of God's freedom. And that, I guess, is another instance of ontological monism. So in this framework, Schelling was trying to make sense of human plurality, but he eventually tried to explain it away or to let it vanish into the kind of unitary monism principle. By contrast, in Hegel, and especially in Hegel's philosophy of religion, we find the idea that the infinite, what's traditionally called the infinite, is not exactly the whole in which all parts would vanish. Rather, it was reinterpreted in Hegel as the very way of the finite beings coming to be and passing away. And the image for it in Hegel's philosophy of religion is the religious community. In the community, there is, of course, a unifying principle, but each individual in it remains an individual. And we could also say, or could even say, precisely because each individual is an individual in the religious community, could they become properly defined individuals. So that, I guess, is a model of reconciliation which helps us build respect for human finitude and human plurality. And those two, I think, are correlated. And I wanted to cite two recent studies which is in line with my interpretation here. So first, George Di Giovanni's recent book talking about religion as the case in which reason, so reason is a big word in Hegel, I know, so reason flourishes at plural sites, at plural individuals in the religious community. And in an earlier book from Terry Pinkard, we also find a diagnosis of the post-Hegelian scenario in German philosophy. So Pinkard said that in that period, people turned to the heroic one. They wanted to have the heroic one, maybe one individual, which solves all the problems. However, what Pinkard saw in Hegel's own philosophy was precisely this plurality, which at times could be a bit messy. So the contrast between messy plurality and heroic one helped us situate Hegel's position in relation to, for example, those later movements in German thought, and it argues against the identification of between Hegel and, for example, a certain Nazi ideology, because here we're still in the problematic of how to have the kind of philosophical respect, or to leave some philosophical space for finite human beings and for their plurality to flourish. That puts an end to my presentation today. Thank you.